Today on High Riding Threads, we're going to do an introduction to Windows performance troubleshooting and an introduction to the Euthyphro. Okay, so today starts our series on Windows performance troubleshooting, and today I want this to be a high-level overview. And the reason is I want it to be a series that can take you from not knowing much of anything about performance troubleshooting to being able to use tools to identify performance bottlenecks and be able to kind of go from there and trying to resolve those problems. When we think of the performance of our desktop computer, laptop, server, the first thing we typically think of is, well, what kind of specs does it have? Is it a powerful HP or Dell or something like IBM? Is it 64-bit? What kind of processor does it have? How much RAM does it have? And we think, well, if we just get more of those things, then we'll be set. We'll be able to handle whatever load it's given. But that's not really an ideal way to think about performance because, one, you need to consider cost, right? So you could just buy the biggest, beefiest machine that you can possibly find, and it would probably run your workload, whatever you're trying to do. What if it's word processing, or if it's video editing, or if it's photo editing, if it's heavy graphics intensive, like you want to get more processing power, more RAM, and that kind of stuff. But you also have to consider cost. So you don't want to just buy the biggest, beefiest thing you can. You need to look at, what am I doing on this computer server, and what are the resources needed? Fortunately, a lot of software companies will specify, if you're going to use our software, you need to have at least 8 gigs of RAM, you need to have this kind of processor or higher, you need to have this kind of graphics card that's compatible. So the first thing you want to do is identify what is it that you're going to be doing on this computer. That's the first question you should be asking when you start to try to spec out your hardware for that application. Okay, but let's say you've done that. Let's say you've done your homework. You've gone through all of the requirements. You bought this machine that very nicely fits the minimum or recommended requirements for whatever application you're going to run. But then you start running the application and it's really slow. It's sluggish. You come in here to Task Manager and you look at the CPU or memory or disk, and they're just spiked to 100%. Then what do you do? How do you even begin to troubleshoot something like that? Because our initial plan of making sure we've gotten our specs has already been taken care of, and our application is still slow. Okay, so the first place we would go would be somewhat intuitive. We would go to something like Task Manager, because Task Manager shows us the resources our computer has, and then it shows how much those resources are being used. So our computer has, right, CPU, memory, disk, networking, maybe additional compute resources. And what we want to see is there something running on this computer that's using this thing such that one of these things cannot respond to the requests that are being asked of it? Okay, so if we see the CPU spiking up to 100% continuously, we know that it's under a heavy workload. So the first thing we identify is, what's under a heavy workload? Is it CPU? Is memory up to 100%? Is disk up to 100%? Is it one of the disks if you have multiple disks? Okay, is your network link, is that 100% utilized? Now, it's not always 100%, but first thing we're doing is we're just trying to find which resource is being used the most. Okay, that's the first step. So now I know which resource is being used. Now I want to know who's using that resource the most. So I go over processes, and let's say our CPU is the most. I can order this column according to most used. And in this case, right now, this process, we can say who is using the most CPU. That's OBS Studio right now. And then that tells us what's being used and who's using it. Now, that sounds really basic, and it is. I mean, these are the kinds of things that probably non-IT people do. They open up their Task Manager if there's computer slow and look at this kind of stuff. But what's interesting is I worked at Microsoft for a while, and one of the first things that I was told by a very well respected engineer there was, if you're going to do performance troubleshooting and performance analysis, the first thing you need to do, go through Task Manager and look at all these different tabs and know what every single one of these things are, right? We might know what utilization is, but what are processes? What are threads? What are handles, right? What is L1 cache? What are those things? Later on in this series, we're going to use the sysinternals suite to try to look at performance-related issues. And if you're not familiar with the sysinternals suite, do a Bing search, Google search, and download those tools. They're free. You just download a zip file and extract them, and then you have access to all of these tools. And these are great tools. And learning how to use them is not a silver bullet for fixing performance issues. You still have to know about Windows internals. What are threads? What are processes? What's a memory leak? That kind of stuff. These tools can help you find that, but without the conceptual framework, these tools will be a lot less effective. They might kind of give you clues, and you can maybe kind of think through it some and do some searching online to see if you can find anything. But really, to be an effective Windows performance troubleshooting person, you need to understand Windows internals and then use the appropriate tools to get the information you need. All right, so let's talk about the Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is a Platonic dialogue, or a dialogue of Plato, that was written back in the 4th century BC, and it's supposed to take place in Athens. And in fact, I've got a little map here, and as you can see, there's something called a royal stoa, and that's supposedly where the dialogue was supposed to take place in Athens, and it's where the civil authorities were. So the character Euthyphro is a man that Plato's character Socrates was talking with in this dialogue, and Socrates and Euthyphro are having a discussion on the nature of piety, and they're doing it in this area because Euthyphro is about to take his father to court over the killing of a slave, and Socrates is questioning him about this, and he wants to know, how is it that Euthyphro is so sure that this is the pious and right thing to do? So Euthyphro responds by saying that he's an expert regarding what the gods desire and want, and it's what the gods desire is pious, and what the gods hate is impious. So Socrates says, hey, awesome, here's an expert, let me ask him what piety is. And if you've read any of the Platonic dialogues, you know that as soon as someone says, hey, I'm an expert in something, that starts a whole bunch of questions from Socrates, which makes for awesome reading. But there's really one question that stands out in the Euthyphro that's talked about to this day, and it's really a question about what is it that makes something pious. The question that Socrates is interested in, and the point that he wants to deal with, he quotes here, this is just a direct quote from the Euthyphro. It says, the point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved by the gods. But what kind of question is that? It's not the kind of question that asks, is this particular thing pious or that particular thing pious, right? Those are simply examples of pious things. What Socrates is after is, what is it that makes something pious or impious? He wants to know the nature of piety, not just examples of piety. So Socrates examines Euthyphro to find out what is the nature of piety. And what he finds is he doesn't really like the answers, which is fairly common in the Platonic dialogues. So one answer is, well, what makes something pious? Well, when the gods love it, it's pious, and when they hate it, it's impious. Socrates is like, well, hey, what if they disagree? And it's like, okay, well, maybe it's if what all the gods agree on, or what all the gods love is pious, and what all the gods hate is impious. And if they don't all agree on it, then it's not necessarily pious or impious. And then Socrates takes the conversation from there. But what they're trying to do is outline, what is it that fundamentally makes something pious or impious? This dilemma of whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved by the gods, is very famous, and it's translated into a newer version that's often used today in contemporary philosophy of religion, and they modify it to talk about goodness and God. So piety is translated into goodness, and gods is translated into God, and it focuses not necessarily on whether or not God loves it or doesn't love it, but on whether or not God wills it. So the contemporary question, or Euthyphro dilemma, is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? And the dilemma is posed to try to get at the heart of what is it that makes something good. If that thing is outside of God, then why do we need to look to God in order to know what is good? We can just look to that thing. But if something is good in virtue of God deciding it to be good, well, how does that not make goodness arbitrary, just dependent on the will of God? This isn't necessarily a problem for all forms of theism. Some people will just bite the bullet and say, yeah, if God wills something to be good, it is good. If God wills something that's bad, then it is bad. What's the problem? Another group, I've even talked with Christian theists who say, well, what's the problem if goodness is outside of God, if goodness just exists necessarily outside of God? But for classical Christianity, for example, God is goodness. He's the grounding of goodness. So this dilemma could pose a problem for that form of theism, at least on the face of it. In the end, the worry is that God isn't goodness itself, or that God could potentially command arbitrary things to be good, like the torturing of innocent children for the fun of it. Can God bring something like that about where he wills that kind of thing is good? And if he can, that just seems morally reprehensible and seems to be a real problem. In full disclosure, I am a Christian theist and a classical Christian theist, and I don't think this problem or this dilemma causes a huge problem for us. And if someone wanted to explore that more, I could potentially do a future video where we did that. But I did want to at least introduce you to the Euthyphro and the particular problem that it poses for defining piety in terms of the gods, or goodness in terms of the gods, or God, and so you're at least better informed. Thanks.